There is a desert at the bottom of Arabia so vast and so empty that the people who live around it call it simply the empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali. A 250,000 square miles of sand with dunes that rise higher than office towers, where for days in any direction there is nothing but heat and silence. And for 1,000 years, the people of Arabia told a story about something hidden inside it. They spoke of a great city, a city of high towers and pillars, rich beyond counting, built by a proud people at the edge of the sands. And they said that the city grew so arrogant that it was destroyed in a single night, buried beneath the dunes and lost forever. In the Quran, it is named Iram of the Pillars. In the 1001 Nights, it is a city of brass and treasure. The explorer T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, called it the Atlantis of the sands and dreamed of finding it. For centuries, it was treated as exactly that, a myth, a moral fable about pride and ruin, no more real than Atlantis itself. Explorers crossed the empty quarter and found nothing. The city, if it had ever existed, was gone. And then, in 1992, a small expedition announced that they had found it, not by crossing the desert on camels, but by looking down at it from space. Hidden beneath the sand, a satellite had traced the faint scars of ancient roads, all converging on a single point. And when they dug at that point, they found walls and towers, and something stranger still, a city that had, quite literally, fallen into the earth. This is the story of how a legend turned out to be partly true, and of the questions that still bury it. We give the lost city the name the old travelers used. They called it Ubar. The man who finally went looking with the tools of the 20th century was not a professional archaeologist. He was a documentary filmmaker named Nicholas Clapp, who had become obsessed with the legend of Ubar, and with a single tantalizing clue. The old desert travelers, men like Bertram Thomas, the first Westerner to cross the empty quarter, had reported that the Bedouins still spoke of a lost city, and even pointed to ancient tracks in the sand they said led toward it. Clapp's idea was simple and radical. If a great caravan city had once stood at the edge of the desert, then for centuries thousands of camels would have walked the same routes toward it, year after year, pressing faint roads into the ground. Those roads might be invisible to a person standing in the dunes, but perhaps not to a camera in orbit. So he went to NASA. In the 1980s and 90s, the space agency's radar instruments, flown on the space shuttle and on satellites like Landsat and the French Spot, could see things the human eye could not. Radar could reach through dry sand to a shallow depth, revealing features buried just beneath the surface. Scientists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory processed the images, and slowly, across the blank face of the desert, a pattern emerged. Faint lines, old tracks, worn by centuries of caravans, threading across the sands, and converging, like spokes toward a hub, on a single unremarkable spot in the Dhofar region of Oman. There was already a name on the map for that spot, a small, half-known waterhole called Shisr, where a ruined fort had stood for as long as anyone could remember. The roads from space all pointed there, and in 1992, the expedition went to dig. What the team uncovered at Shisr was not a city of brass and pillars from the 1001 Nights. It was something more believable, and in its way, more impressive, a desert fortress standing guard over water. Leading the archaeology was Juris Zarins, a specialist in the ancient Near East. Among the expedition was the British explorer Ranulph Fiennes. As they cleared the sand, the outline of a substantial structure appeared. Walls enclosing a compound, reinforced with towers, perhaps 8 of them, set around the rim. At the center was the thing that made the site matter, a deep, natural cavern in the limestone, holding water. In a desert this absolute, a permanent spring was not merely useful. It was the reason a place could exist here at all, and the finds told the story of what that place had been. Scattered through the ruins were fragments of pottery and glass that had come from far away, from Greece and Rome, from Mesopotamia and beyond. tiny pieces of a vast trading world, carried here across hundreds of miles of sand. This had been a caravan station, a fortified watering hole on one of the great trade routes of antiquity, where camel trains stopped to drink and resupply on a journey worth more than gold. Because the thing those caravans carried was frankincense. The Dhofar region of Oman produced the finest frankincense in the ancient world, a fragrant resin tapped from hardy desert trees, burned in temples from Jerusalem to Rome, and prized as highly as silver. Shisr sat near the beginning of the Incense Road, the network that carried that treasure north across Arabia. A fort here controlled water, and whoever controlled the water controlled the trade. The people of this place had grown rich on smoke. But the most extraordinary discovery at Shisr was not what the people built. It was what happened to it. Remember the cavern at the heart of the fort, the underground chamber that held the precious water. The settlement had been built directly on top of it, around its mouth, for thousands of years. And at some point, that proved to be a fatal mistake. The roof of the limestone cavern collapsed. We do not know exactly why. Perhaps the great spring that had sustained the place slowly emptied, and the water that had buoyed up the cavern's roof was gone. Perhaps centuries of building and weight above finally broke it. But the result is written in the ruins themselves. A large sinkhole opened beneath the fortress, and a portion of the settlement, towers, walls, whatever stood above, simply dropped into the earth and was swallowed. Stand at the site today and you can see it. A section of the fort tipped and shattered at the lip of a collapsed hollow, as if a piece of the ground had been pulled out from under it. The very thing that had made the city possible, the cavern, the water, was the thing that destroyed it. And here is where archaeology brushes up against legend in a way that is genuinely uncanny. The old story said that the proud city at the edge of the sands was destroyed in a single catastrophe and swallowed by the desert. At Shisr, a real city was, in the most literal sense, swallowed by the ground beneath it. The myth of a place that vanished into the sand was not pure invention. Something had happened here that people would have remembered and feared, and turned into a story of divine punishment for 1,000 years. When the discovery was announced to the world in 1992, the headlines were triumphant. The lost city of Ubar, the Atlantis of the sands, had been found. But the archaeologists were more careful than the headlines, and the honest picture is more tangled. Start with the legend itself. The city of the old stories is tied to a people the Arabian tradition calls the Odd, and their proud king, who built Iram of the many pillars in defiance of God. That is a tale of moral ruin, handed down through poetry and scripture. What the team found at Shisr was a real, gritty, working trade fort. The two are not obviously the same thing, and proving that this particular ruin is the city named in the Quran is, frankly, beyond what the evidence can do. Juris Zarins, the archaeologist who led the dig, understood this better than anyone, and his own view was subtle. He argued that Ubar may never have been a single city at all. In some ancient sources, the word seems to describe a region or a people, the frankincense lands of southern Arabia and those who controlled them, rather than one set of walls. By that reading, Shisr is not the lost city of Ubar marked like a dot on a treasure map. It is one important center within the wider world that the legend of Ubar remembered. Other scholars went further and were simply skeptical, pointing out that a modest desert fort, however dramatic its collapse, is a long way from a fabled metropolis of brass and pillars. And they have a point. The romance of the story and the reality of the stones do not line up neatly. But what is not in doubt is that a real, wealthy, ancient trade center stood here, and that it really did fall into the earth. So if Shisr is not quite the storybook city, what did the search actually reveal? Something arguably greater than a single ruin, the shape of a lost world. The same satellite images that led the team to the fort kept revealing more. Not just the tracks converging on Shisr, but a whole web of ancient routes stitched across southern Arabia, the buried arteries of the frankincense trade. For perhaps 3,000 years, from deep in antiquity into the early centuries of the Common Era, caravans had moved along these roads, carrying Dhofar's incense north to the markets and temples of the ancient world. This was one of the richest trades in human history. It had built kingdoms, and it had run, in part, through this single fortified well in the sand. That is the real revelation of Ubar. The legend of a fabulously wealthy city at the edge of the empty quarter was not conjured out of nothing. It was the memory of genuine riches, of a frankincense economy so lucrative that the outposts guarding its water grew prosperous and proud, and of at least one of them meeting a sudden, dramatic end when the ground opened beneath it. Strip away the brass towers and the divine wrath, and what remains is history, a real trade, real wealth, a real catastrophe. The story grew in the retelling, as stories do. But at its core was something that had actually happened, in a place you can now stand in, at the edge of the largest sand desert on Earth. And yet, for all that the satellites and the spades have shown us, the empty quarter keeps most of its secrets. We still cannot say, with any certainty, that Shisr is the Ubar of legend, or that Ubar was ever one findable place. The identification that made the headlines remains at best unproven, a romantic name laid over a real but more modest ruin. The people the legend blames for the city's pride, the odd, sit on the very edge of history and myth, and we know far less about them than the stories pretend. And the desert itself has barely been read. The radar that found the roads to Shisr only scratched the surface of a wilderness the size of a country, where the dunes shift and bury and uncover on their own slow schedule. Somewhere out under that sand may lie other forts, other wells, other centers of the incense trade, or nothing at all. We have found one thread of a vanished economy and pulled it loose. The rest is still woven into the dunes. So picture the empty quarter one more time. That ocean of sand where 1,000 years of travelers swore a great city lay buried, and where, against all odds, a real lost place was finally pulled back into the light, only to leave us arguing about its name. The legend said a proud city was swallowed by the desert. We now know that, in at least one spot, a city really was. What we still do not know is how much more the sand is keeping, and whether the Atlantis of the sands was ever a single city at all, or simply the desert's memory of everything it has taken. Ubar has given up part of its mystery. We can stand in the fort at Shisr, look down into the sinkhole that swallowed it, and trace from space the roads that once carried its wealth across the sand. But whether this was truly the lost city of legend, the Atlantis of the sands, may never be settled. The desert offered up one ruin and kept the rest. Some cities don't want to be found, and some hide so well that even when we find them, we cannot be sure that we have. Buried worlds. Next time, we leave the desert for a river plain 5,000 years ago, in a city so perfectly planned, so far ahead of its age, that it should not have been possible. Built by a people whose writing we still cannot read, who left no kings, no temples, and no explanation. We call it Mohenjo-Daro. Mohenjo-Daro, a perfect city 5,000 years old, built by a people who vanished with